Many of us here know at St. Anthony's, we talk about suffering a number of times throughout the year. We do that regularly so that we can find strength and encouragement in Jesus. And perhaps each of us could respond to the following statements, and these have to do with the meaning of suffering. So, statement number one, I see benefits from the suffering I'm going through right now. Would you say yes, no, or somewhat? I see benefits from the suffering I'm going through right now. Next, I know what God is trying to do through my suffering right now. Yes, no, somewhat. I know what God is trying to do. Finally, Deacon Andrew causes me great suffering. Yes or yes? The answer is yes. Okay. So I have to say, when we talk about suffering, I don't want to offer cold comfort. If you're really going through a hard time, there are times in our life when the suffering is so overwhelming, nothing will give us consolation. So I'm very sorry if you're in that state right now. But at least if we can do our best, try to unite ourselves to Jesus. So this is the teaching we're going to draw from the second reading. If we are in great pain, maybe, and we can't see the benefits or what God is trying to do, we can't see the why. How about this? Don't start with the why. Why am I suffering? Why is this happening to me? Let's start with the question of what. What can I do? Specifically, what can I do to help other people? We'll start with that question, and then we'll go to the why afterwards. Now, the reading says this: because Jesus himself was tested by what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested. Because Jesus himself was tested by what he suffered, he's able to help those who are being tested. Jesus knows what it's like to experience the worst sufferings: abandonment, physical, mental, torture, to even feel abandoned by God the Father. This is very beautiful, because Jesus not only helps us, but he understands us. He understands the pain of what we're going through. I read about a teenager in Texas. She's a quadriplegic, and she spends her days watching TV and reading newspapers, and she looks for stories of people who are suffering. Whenever she comes across a story of someone who's suffering, she asks someone to put a stick in her mouth, and she starts typing out letters of encouragement to those people. So in her suffering, she reaches out to other people who are suffering. This is Matt Hampson. So he's also a quadriplegic. He became a quadriplegic after a rugby accident, and he started, it's called the Get Busy Living Center. And he calls it the Get Busy Living Center because in his TED Talk, he said, we can either, in an accident, suffering, we can either get busy living or get busy dying. Now notice in these two cases, these people with horrible injuries, they're not focused on why. Maybe I'm sure they've gone through that. They're really focused on what. What can I do? Not what can't I do. What can I do now, specifically to help other people? I'm not saying this is easy. I'm just saying it's a good place to start when we're in pain. I also read about a man named Peter. He had a beautiful long marriage. He spent a lot of years taking care of his sick wife, and she died in 2017. And so when she passed away, there was this huge void in his daily schedule. What does he do now with all that time? So he spent most of that time going to a nursing home, visiting people who are so desperately lonely. Venerable Archbishop Sheen, he has some advice for people, he says, who are going through an existential neurosis. Basically, he's saying they're going through an anxiety. They don't know what their life is about. They don't know the meaning of their life. And he says if we're ever in that state, the first thing to do is go help your neighbor. He says prayer comes after that, when you're in that state. First thing, go out and help someone, and then pray. So that is what we can do, the what. Now let's turn to the why. Now the second reading is about how Jesus, who is God, is perfectly united to humanity, and especially in our suffering. So it says, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many sons and daughters to glory, should make the source of their salvation perfect through sufferings. So this letter to the Hebrews was written to a group of Christians in the 1st century AD who were being persecuted. And so the author is telling these Christians, they're having a horrible time, Jesus is united with you in your suffering. Now that first phrase, it was fitting. Now that means what might seem inappropriate in our minds is perfectly appropriate according to God's plan. Now what is God's plan? It says, to bring many sons and daughters to glory. That means heaven. The goal is to get all of us to heaven. Now heaven is a state of perfect love, meaning not only do we receive love in heaven perfectly, but love comes out of us perfectly. So the only people who are in heaven are those out of whom perfect love comes. Now how do you get to that state where you can love perfectly? It's only through suffering where love is perfected. And so the author says, God the Father's plan was to make the source of our salvation, who is Jesus, perfect through suffering. Jesus in his humanity becomes perfect, and all those who believe in him and are united to him, we share in him. That's how we can become perfect. Some of us might remember the Jewish psychotherapist named Viktor Frankl. He was in Auschwitz during World War II, the concentration camp, and he told this beautiful story about lining up for food. So normally prisoners were selected to give soup to each other, to just serve each other. And he said normally everyone would look at who they're serving and they would dip to the bottom to give the potatoes to their friends. But for everyone else, they would skim the surface and give watery soup. But he said there was one man there who never looked at who was lining up, and he gave equally to everyone. So Viktor Frankl wrote, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." Jesus has two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. Now the divine nature can already love perfectly. The human nature has to grow in love. So when it says here, make perfect, that verb in the Greek means that Jesus' human nature is being divinized, it's becoming like God. And this same verb is used 3 times in the Greek Old Testament to refer to the ordination of priests. So Jesus, he was ordained a priest, if you will, through his suffering. As contrast, I was ordained in Richmond by the laying on of hands and by the bishop praying the consecratory prayer over me. That's how I became a priest. Jesus became a priest through his suffering on the cross. And so a priest is the best priest, becomes a great priest, when he offers himself, like Jesus, for the good of other people. This is Bishop Yunan Tombe of Sudan. He said, "I was born in war, brought up in war, and studied in war. Perhaps that has helped me to get through this and to understand that it is possible to do more, and that God is with us. Since 2008, over 500,000 people have died in conflicts in Sudan." And Bishop Tombe, he shared a beautiful story about the first day of the bombing. The bombing apparently blew out the windows of his cathedral, and he was in the chapel praying. And some Muslim soldiers jumped over the wall and went into the chapel to find refuge. And he says, "After 3 hours, the fighting subsided and they all left. But after some hours, one of them came back and told me, while pointing at the tabernacle, 'Bishop, this candle is strong, it has protected us.' He didn't understand that the candle was there because of the Blessed Sacrament. From that day, I took up the candle and the Blessed Sacrament as my strength. and I have managed to have adoration every day, 4 times a day. I divide my time between the people and God. I get my strength from the Blessed Sacrament and believe that this is my strength and my joy. So I just think that's an incredible story of a beautiful priest, suffering like Jesus, but loving like Jesus. And what does he and his fellow Catholics do? They keep their schools open. So almost all the other schools, actually, according to what I read, all the schools in his city have closed, except for 13 Catholic schools. And the governor came to the bishop and said, "Thank you for keeping your schools open." So they love Jesus so much, they're trying to help their neighbor. And they now have 70 seminarians in their diocese, and 6 of them will be ordained this year. Next week, we start our annual 4-part pro-life series. Normally, we talk about abortion. Last year, we talked about in vitro fertilization. This year, we're going to talk about euthanasia. And today's homily is a good preparation because we're talking about the biblical perspective on human suffering. When we look at the cross, we see that Jesus lost everything and he still loved perfectly. And just keep in mind, we don't have to suffer forever. We only have a very short time on this earth in order to grow towards perfect love. And Jesus helps us, I think, more than we realize. So when we suffer, maybe don't start with why. We can get to that later. Start with the question of, what can I do to help other people the way Jesus did?